Hi, I'm Philip, one of the co-founders of Spice AI, and today I'll show how easy it is to perform federated SQL queries across multiple data sources using the Spice runtime. Let's say I'm building an application that needs to provide a unified view of sales data that I have spread across multiple different sources. What I can do then is create a Spice pod that references those data sources and load it into the Spice runtime, and then configure my application to query against the Spice runtime directly, which will allow me to have a single point of entry and unified query interface to be able to query across all three of those different sources. So it all begins with a Spice pod. So I'll come over to my VS Code window where I've already got a Spice pod configured. And you'll see here I have 5 different data sets from 3 different sources. One, it's a Postgres source, one is an S3 source, and then another accelerated version, and then a Dremio source and an accelerated version of that. So by default, when you configure these data sets, they aren't accelerated. So this Dremio one is configured to go directly to Dremio and load in this taxi trips data set. But every time you query against this Dremio source within the runtime, it's actually going to go and query Dremio directly. So this is good because it gives you the most up-to-date data from the source directly, but the downside is that you have to wait at query time for that data to be loaded from the remote data source, which may not be next to your application. Whereas in the accelerated version, we have this new acceleration setting, which tells the runtime to pull a copy of the data locally, which allows queries against this data set, this accelerated version, to be much faster because it's just querying against data that it has loaded in memory. Similar for S3, we have pulling a Parquet file from S3, and similarly, we have an acceleration for that as well. We support multiple different types of acceleration, so by default, we'll store it as arrow records in memory, but you can also choose different engines such as SQLite, DuckDB, or Postgres. And for SQLite and DuckDB, we actually support storing it as a file mode instead of just in memory if you have a data set that's larger than memory that you want to fit into a file, or if you have specific characteristics of your data that makes it perform better in SQLite or DuckDB or etc. So I'll go ahead and start my runtime, and we'll see here that the runtime has loaded the different data sources, and in a separate terminal window I'll actually load the Spice SQL REPL, which will give me a query editor which I can use to make some queries. So first I'll just do a query against the S3 source. You'll see here that it takes around 2.5 seconds to get 3,000 rows. But if I do a same query against the accelerated version, it's much faster, returning the same data. And what I actually want to do in my application is aggregate some data across all of these different data sources. So I'm going to write this aggregation query that combines sales data from my Postgres source, combines it from the S3 source and the Dremio source. And then I'll sum up all the sales together across these different sources, count up the number of transactions, find the max sales value and the average sales value. So I'll run this query, and it will take a couple seconds to run because, again, it's going to the source directly to pull the latest data, and it takes around 3.5 seconds. But I have a different version of this query, which is basically the same, but just replaces it for the accelerated tables that we have in the runtime. And we can see we get the same data results, but it returned in a much faster time period. So great, I've very quickly gotten the result that I wanted, which has done a fairly complex aggregation that loaded data from multiple sources. And so I can now configure my application to hard code this query into it and then configure it to talk to the local Spice runtime. So that was a quick overview of using Spice to perform federated SQL queries across multiple data sources. It provides tools for accelerating those queries by keeping a local copy up to date automatically, and it abstracts away the implementation details of connecting to those resources so you can focus on adding value with your application. So if this looks interesting, please head over to our GitHub repo to download it and try it out for yourself.